Hi, everybody. Good morning. Really excited to be here with JJ, who is a longtime customer and supporter of Writer and a friend. And it's going to be a fun chat. What I am really excited for everybody to really do today is get some insight from folks who have been in generative AI, using it in a very principled way for a couple of years now. And what you all are going to hear about JJ is kind of what has happened internally, even in the last 6 months over at Intuit, as just the global fervor on AI has gotten executive attention everywhere, including at Intuit, but how a content team that is really steeped in strategy hasn't lost its way or been taken over by hype throughout all of this. And it is not a surprise that it is JJ's team that has been asked to come up with the guidelines for using AI for the entire team, because it is also the same team at Intuit that has been responsible for the style and guideline and voice principles that have guided all content creation across the Intuit ecosystem. So here we've got a snapshot of an incredible resource that you all have built over the past few years for the tens of thousands of folks that work at Intuit and the various products. QuickBooks, TurboTax, and MailChimp are literally some of the most popular consumer products in America, with 50 million combined
something like
users?
That.
Yeah, it's huge.
We have MailChimp.
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty big. Yeah.
And their AI use to date has been really impressive too. So across email, the entire product journey, help content, as well as ideation across a number of fronts. And this is across the various products of Intuit.
Correct.
And so leads us to the discussion that we want to have today. You all were asked to develop guidelines for using AI based on both the deep exploration of AI that you had done to date.
Correct.
As well as the just expertise around principled approaches to content strategy. We'd love to hear about that journey, JJ. Tell us how it got started,
Sure.
who asked you, and how did you begin?
Yeah, so we've been really in the sort of business of AI for a long time. With our content design team, we've been working on AI projects for 3.5, 4 years. We developed an in-house capability called Elroy, which was very, very, very
I remember
basic.
Elroy.
Yeah, so very basic. And it was essentially a way of testing how can we start to operationalize generative AI within our workflows. And so when we started that project, it was quite small. We didn't use it for a lot. Honestly, it wasn't great. And it took a long time to come up with sort of any usable content from that. But we've come a long way. And now we're at a point where there's so many folks on our team that need to leverage this and honestly should be leveraging this. So it made sense that we've done guidelines for everything. We have our voice and tone guidelines. We have our style guidelines. We've done accessibility, anti-racist language. We have a lot of different guidelines that we do that are across Intuit. So it's not just voice and tone is specific to each brand, but these larger guidelines go across our entire organization. So it was a no-brainer when the past 2-3 months, ChatGPT has been blowing up. It's like we are going to have some kind of process and guidelines around how we use these tools, and what does that look like for teams, and making sure that we're able to create some kind of comfort with folks, because this is a new technology, and so put some principles around it that make it so we can operationalize it. And I guess we don't have those yet, the principles, but you can see up here that some of the things that we thought about with principles were How do they reflect the values of our content team, our design team, of Intuit as a whole? We definitely wanted to think about how these would help writers make decisions when they're using these tools, and not disrupt the flow of work. And then thought leadership is another way that we tried to add to these.
We're going to walk through them, by the way.
Yeah,
we'll
go
walk the
through all of
journey
it.
and then
Yeah,
show the
yeah.
principles. Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of how we got started. And I should say it was a very small team of us. We started with folks who were really passionate about AI. So we didn't need to ask for volunteers. We just naturally started to kind of come together and say, okay, there's a handful of us that are really passionate about what we can do with generative AI. And again, this is focused specifically on how we use this internally. And we got together, and our director was like, let's think about what we can do with principles and how we can leverage this and, again, enable our teams to work with this sort of technology. So this is an example of, as we started this process, we started with a Fig Jam for anybody that uses Figma. And again, small team, went through sort of what are our hopes, our fears around using this technology, around leveraging this in our workflows. I should say all in, this didn't take long. We probably spent, I'll say 2 weeks on the upfront kind of research work that we've done here, but you can see some of the things that have come up there, things that we talk about on a regular basis when we're talking about AI. Certainly the loss of humanity, human experiences, jobs, those are all of the watch-outs and fears that came up. But there's a lot of great things that we can leverage in terms of thinking about content quality and the strategic impact that our designers can have. So we really leaned into all of that. Once we finished with the Fig Jam, we went through and took a look at all of the principles that I've mentioned. So the voice and tone principles, our style guide, any values-based principles that we had, those were all used as inputs into what we ended up creating as an output for our principles.
You know what's so interesting? I just realized this. All of the things in the strengths, so consistency at scale, improved content quality, greater strategic impact, we were talking about those things when you all brought Writer on 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Right, which is so funny. And now it's like loss of trust, loss of jobs, societal impact, and like brand and marketing teams are having to like really think about the social impact of them doing all of the things that they've wanted to do as a result of this going mainstream so quickly, and just the fears of AI. It feels like a heavy thing to be grappling with when you all just want to be a lot more efficient.
Yeah. I mean, and these things are legitimate issues.
Absolutely.
And there's certainly things that we should be concerned about, we should be thinking about. But I think the most important part of all of this is that AI is a tool. It's not a human. It's a tool that humans use in order to improve workflows and in order to improve how they interact with words. And so as long as you continue to think about it that way, I guess for me, as someone who is a writer, that eases my mind. I don't think about it as like, oh, this is coming to take my job. I think about it as this is a partner, this is a tool, this is an intern in some respects, right? And so I think that's just a way to have ease with it and not get caught up in the sort of press and the news stories of like, here it comes, everybody's out of a job. Right. I really do not believe that to be the truth.
Yeah,
so
I love that. Now, digging into some of the harder parts, right? You all definitely talk to other teams.
Certainly.
And some of whom were like legal, working on their own kind of internal types of regulations. What were the additional considerations that you both thought about internally as well as came up from taking this, across corporate functions?
Yeah, we have a lot of teams that are working on AI, as you can imagine. We're a pretty massive company. We have a whole division of people that they're just dedicated to essentially looking at AI and how we can use this across the entire organization.
The futures team.
Yes, the futures team on the design side. Exactly, yeah. So we certainly had to take into consideration all of the folks who are already working on projects within that space. And we pulled their designer into this principles work to make sure that we had that input. So making sure we had the right team together right from the get-go was really important. So, we mentioned TurboTax and MailChimp, and Intuit has a brand, and then QuickBooks. So folks from all of those areas, it was important to make sure that they were in right from the start. So we've got buy-in from all of our teams, everyone who's going to be using these principles. I think the other thing we needed to consider was the audience for this. So for these particular principles, they're really focused on writers. They're focused on content designers and content strategists who are going to be in the weeds using this on a day-to-day basis. I wouldn't go so far to say that they're focused on anyone who's writing, because you do need a bit of a background in voice and tone. You should have some understanding around kind of the tools that we use as content designers. But that's not to say that someone couldn't pick up these principles and get a good understanding of at least how to interact and engage with AI when you're thinking about crafting content. Legal and ethics is something that you and I had talked about, and we have a legal team that's working on all of that. So we already have drafted principles and guidelines from the legal team. So we didn't need to take that. We didn't need to recreate that, rather. So we were definitely mindful of any other sets of principles that were out there that would be kind of interconnected and related to what we were doing. So we gathered all of that information up front and certainly let folks know that, hey, this is something that we're working on putting together. And if there was any sort of input or advice they had along the way, we would gladly take it. I think that's everything that we considered. I mean, existing principles, we talked a bit about voice and tone and all of that. So considering all of those. Those are the big ones.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So what were some of the big takeaways from kind of the all-in 4 to 6 week process?
Yeah.
That felt kind of intense.
It was intense. I think probably the biggest takeaway is your work is never done. These principles have to be a living, breathing thing. It can't be something that is just a one and done, and once you're done, you shelve it, and these are the principles. Because the technology is constantly shifting and changing, there's no way that these are things that are static, that can't have flexibility. So I think we took that mindset, maybe not at the beginning, but as we started working through these and thinking about the technology, it's like, oof, we don't really know 6 months down the road if we're going to need to add to these principles, if we're going to need to maybe take away a principle, who knows? But making sure that it's something that's really flexible and nimble, that's probably one of the biggest takeaways. And certainly involving the right people is a must. You need to bring everyone along. If you don't, you're going to have people who potentially are creating their own principles in a pocket. And you certainly don't want teams operating off of multiple principles. That's not going to create any efficiency in your process. And I think this isn't necessarily around this process, but one of the things that we got to thinking as we were working through all of the principles and kind of getting to a final state was that it's important to remember that content strategy is at the heart of generative AI. You can't have any kind of decent outputs from any generative AI tool without first having the right strategy set in place by your content strategy or your content design team, or maybe it's a team of writers. But we had all of that set in place. So the principles allow us to understand how to use the tools in the best way possible, but it's our frameworks and our messaging strategies that allow us to actually create the content that is usable. It just makes us more efficient. But without the strategy, you really don't have anything.
I love that so much. Like, say that louder. That is absolutely what we see as well.
I mean, the content design discipline has become so much more important, so much more key now because of AI. You need all of the prompt inputs, all of that thinking, that strategic thinking around voice and tone, around audience, around personalization. All of that comes from your content designers and your content strategists. They're the brains behind all of this. And being able to leverage these AI tools allows these designers to, instead of being in the weeds of creating like 10 subject lines, create 7 versions of this email, we can get away from that and we can start to look at at a higher altitude at, okay, what is this work? Like, what is the strategic input that goes into this to really deliver and drive what we're after? So,
yeah, content that's actually going to drive business results.
Exactly.
As a result of strategy.
yep, yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
I love that so much. All right. Let us talk
This is
about.
big.
Yeah, exactly.
Do not create principles for the sake of principles. I think that's probably the same as like, don't use AI just because it's there if you don't need it. If your principles are not something that's understandable and usable by teams, it's just a piece of paper that is useless. So making sure that those things are understandable, making sure that they're usable, testing them with your teams. Certainly I mentioned we had a core group working on this, but we were shopping these around to designers all over the place to make sure that it made sense, to make sure that they, just do you understand these principles? Do they work for you? Can you use this in your workflow? Are we missing anything? But having those conversations were really, really important and really key.
Cool. All right. Let's talk about the principles next.
Oh, boy.
All right. Let's start with number 1.
So I think I will say just at the top of this,
Yep.
I've already kind of talked about this already, but we found it to be important to ground everyone in why we created these principles, what they're designed to do, so folks know what they're not designed to do. So I mentioned voice and tone. I mentioned aligning with values, providing thought leadership, but also, it's increased efficiency and hopefully greater quality in terms of the output, provided you're leveraging your strategy up front. But then when you get into the principles, the first one's probably the most important. AI is not magic. It's humans. Humans are behind this, and humans are creating these prompts. Humans are behind or editing the content, making sure the outputs are something that's usable. And I think we wanted to say that up front because just in our interactions with folks outside of the content team, we had a lot of people who were thinking that, oh, wow, it's this like magic machine that just outputs content and, kind of like one and done, and you have all this usable content, and that's really not the case. So we found it to be very important to make sure that people understand that you have to have a human, you have to have a content designer in the mix working to get you to where you want to be.
I love the preface, actually, and this is not obvious, I think, to a lot of folks, but having a charter, right? Like, this is why we're doing it, everybody. There's like this set of reasons, we're all aligned on them, they're transparent, we're all bought into why we're doing it. And then the principles really derive from that.
Right. Don't assume accuracy and truth. Again, I think we've all seen where generative AI tools have gone wrong and given misinformation. So certainly being aware of what hallucinations look like and remembering that the expert is you. You have the knowledge, and your job is to input that knowledge into this tool and in order to get the output that you're looking for. So certainly just having blind trust in any of these tools is not advised.
And you all did training on that, right?
We did.
And do training, ongoing training.
Correct, yeah. So we basically had a lockdown on any kind of generative AI tool, and Except Writer, that's true. Because you can't trust. You couldn't trust, well, where's this information going, what's going in? Certainly you've got so many people working in these tools, so it made sense to shut it down. And we're dealing with sensitive information, right? Tax information, small business information. So, but now, in order to leverage what is now, it's an internal version of these tools, which is on our rails and very guarded. You still need to go through training. So it's a small, quick training. It's not painful, but it is just to kind of wake people up to the fact that there are things that are pretty big watch-outs when you're using these tools, and so that's a mandatory. And we have a lot of different training like that. We have a voice and tone training. We have whatnot, but the AI training is a little unusual in that you're locked out of using any of these tools until you do the training. So, except Writer. The difference with Writer is we have a team that's working on Writer, and it's not just available broadly to anyone in the company, you have to be within the content team in order to access that. So
the expert users
exactly.
versus more generalists.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
Respect and inclusion. So this is obviously really key. Bias is something that we talk about a lot when it comes to AI, and I think it's important. I had a great conversation last night about human bias, right? Humans are all biased. So bias is going to be everywhere all the time. And we can't expect perfection out of any AI tool. But we can watch out. We can make sure that we're looking at the content, we're looking at the output, and if something doesn't look right, that we're mindful of that. We're editing that. Again, it's where that human involvement, has to be there to ensure that while humans may be biased, we can certainly try to prevent obvious bias through AI tools by just being on the lookout for it. And again, that's based off of some values that we already have. So it's important to have that in there.
And to be clear, you all have actually built in your anti-racist and inclusion language guidelines into Writer.
Correct.
Actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And our style guide and voice and tone. Everything's in there. It's great.
So that helps on the inclusion part.
Absolutely. And the last one is essentially that you're in control, right? Again, this is not something that AI tools require human interaction, and when you're using that tool as a writer, you're responsible for the output. So if you are not checking the output for bias and you're not, testing it, is this a hallucination? Is this true? Well, that's your responsibility. So it was also really important to have that in there, because if someone is creating something and they don't check it and they put it out there and it ends up having, I don't know, it's not factual, they can't go back and say, oh, well, AI said, It's like, no, that's on you. You're the expert, and you need to be checking these things. There has to be the human engagement, and we can't just default to saying, well, the bot said it's right, so I just went with it. So that's the last principle. And these are, we're still looking at these. We're still trying to decide, is this enough? Is this all we need? Do we need more? Are there other details that are missing? So that's why I say it's something that has to be flexible, living, breathing kind of document. It will be ever evolving, I think.
Yeah. I'd love to go back to, thank you so much, JJ. I'd love to go back to where you all are using Writer, using AI today, and where you don't, right?
Yeah.
If it has to do with the principles.
It does.
Okay, tell us more.
So, and this is current state today. So this could change, right? But currently, you'll see that a lot of the stuff that we're using it for is pretty. I'll call it kind of basic content, right? Emails, disclaimers, help content. Certainly, AI is really good for creative exploration, summarization, variants. So, if you need 10 or 100 subject lines, AI's it's great. But where we're not going to use it, and I can confidently say where we will never use it, is to build strategies. So when we're thinking about messaging strategies for any of our brands, any of our products, that we would not leave that to generative AI to create that. It doesn't make sense. Generative AI doesn't know what we know. It doesn't have the customer empathy that we have. So I would never see a situation where we would ever leverage any generative AI tool to do anything that involved developing the strategies for what would inevitably be the input for AI.
And I love that.
Yeah.
I want to double click on that because even when generative AI feels like, oh, this is a great messaging strategy, it's not actually rooted in real inputs into that strategy that you can trace back. And if you don't put those strategies on your team's plate, then the ability to have deeply thoughtful people driving all the other derivative stuff becomes just much more risky. And so we've seen even when AI can be good at a bunch of content, teams that are really good at this choosing to say, we're just not going to use AI here. This is going to be a handcrafted, expert-crafted process.
It's about being purposeful,
Yeah.
right? Being very purposeful when you're using it, how you're using it, what are you trying to get out of it. So I think, you're spot on. It just does not make sense that we would ever leverage this for strategy. There may be parts of strategy, maybe if we're...
The counterfactual, I like asking, here's my strategy. What would an expert who thought ABC think of it, right, to test it?
Yeah. I mean, even if we're looking at, sometimes when we kick off strategies and we're trying to kind of figure out what's the main idea, what's the main sort of takeaway from it, I could see where we might use AI to maybe test some different versions of that, like get some different versions, use that in testing. But again, it wouldn't be something that we'd kind of use
to conceive.
Alone. Yeah. It goes back to content exploration. We'll use it for exploration forever, but we wouldn't use it to actually just build the entire strategic documentation for something.
Yeah.
Campaigns, not something we would use generative AI for. Again, it's something that's too broad, it's too subjective. It's not, you couldn't really build a prompt around putting together, like, say, a brand campaign.
Can I gripe for a sec?
Yeah.
Okay, just this part, Chatham House rules. So SAP for a headline said, all right, for the next week or so, I think it's a week, all of our Times Square billboards are going to be written by AI and the image will be generated by AI. And oh yay, we saved so much time. This used to take weeks. And I'm thinking, really? Like that beautiful headline and that campaign in Times Square, you deprived your copywriters of getting to write that? Come on.
It's very lazy.
So lazy. And it was clearly for the headline, right? It's so short-lived also. And you just kind of demoralized people that had been putting their best work.
I think that's a really important point, right? I mean, when I think about the designers on my team and where they want to spend their time, it's not churn and burn content of,
Variants.
10 subject lines, right? It's thinking about, how do we put together a campaign around, whatever it is that we're working on for, our fall tax campaign or whatnot. It's that creative thinking.
It's the Subway ads. I love your ads.
Yeah. I mean, that's not something we would just leave to AI. Again, it does point to that kind of laziness, I feel like.
Yeah.
The most creative ideas are not going to come from generative AI. They're going to come from humans who maybe are using generative AI, right? But it's still human-driven. You still need people in there for campaigns. That Times Square, no good.
All right, let's do one question because we are at the end of the session, but we'll do one question. Anybody's got? Anyone have a question for JJ?
Thanks. Hi there, I'm Roman from Appen. I was interested that you built in some anti-racist kind of features into the models you're using. Just for me, it was good to understand how long did that take? Who is involved? What sort of volumes did you put into there?
Yeah, definitely take a look at our contentdesign.intuit site because you can find our entire, all of our guidelines are on there and there's an entire section built around that so you can actually see what the output looks like. That project was, I'm trying to think of how long ago we did that.
This was maybe 4 years?
Yeah, 4-ish years ago, before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And again, it started with a small team of people who crafted those principles. And I mean, we were at a time where it just made sense to start thinking about looking at that in our content and putting that together, right? And it's something that we've shared with, I feel like we had a talk with maybe Condé Nast. Like there were quite a few different companies that reached out after they had heard that we were creating these guidelines, and we shared our process with them. But definitely, I say take a look at the output of that, And a lot of it really is what I said today around, having that small team, making sure that it's something that's community driven, people who are passionate about putting these things together. It's really helpful to have that gives those projects the energy to kind of keep them going.
You all even had an engineering team that used our API to then build a Slack bot that helped with inclusive language using the guidelines. It was really amazing. Very community-led.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it wasn't something that someone came out and said, we need to do this. It really was truly from the content community saying, I think there's an opportunity here for us to do something that we're not seeing other people do.
Yeah, it was before BLM and everything.
Yeah. And that tends to be, our community functions very much like that. It's the same way with these guidelines. It's something where it's just like, these aren't coming from anywhere. We know these are needed. Let's get ahead of it. Let's do it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, ahead of your time, as always. Thank you so much, JJ, for sharing. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thanks.